Welcome back to season 13 of the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast, where we connect the science-based evidence behind social and emotional learning and emotional intelligence training for improved well-being, achievement, productivity, and results using what I saw as the missing link, since we weren't taught this when we were growing up in school: the application of practical neuroscience. I'm Andrea Samadi, an author and an educator with a passion for learning, and launched this podcast 7 years ago now with the goal of bringing all the leading experts together in one place to help us to apply this research in our daily lives. For today's episode, number 364, we meet with Dr. Robert Melillo. He's a leading expert in developmental neurological conditions such as ADHD, autism, OCD, tics, dyslexia, anxiety, and depression in both children and adults. He's the co-founder of Brain Balance Achievement Centers, the developer of the Melillo method, and he runs the Melillo Center for Developing Minds in New York. His book, Disconnected Kids, the groundbreaking brain balance program for children with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other neurological disorders, is now in its third edition, and it's endorsed by Daniel Goleman, the author of Emotional Intelligence, who calls his book a visionary new approach. Disconnected Kids is a comprehensive at-home guide to his brain balance program, which involves no medication or medical interventions, but focuses instead on movement and sensory exercises that stimulate proper brain development. This updated and revised edition also features new exercises and the latest research findings on how the retention of primitive reflexes, the involuntary movements babies are born with that typically are replaced with intentional movements by their first birthday, plays an integral role in the development of neurological issues. Through the exercises in this book, these reflexes can be diminished, making brain balance easier to attain. Disconnected Kids helps readers guide children susceptible to brain imbalance to overcome challenges and allow their true gifted selves to shine. Let's now meet Dr. Robert Melillo and learn together about his new visionary approach to help all children uncover their authentic gifts and shine. Welcome, Dr. Robert Melillo. Thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. Have we reached you in New York today? I think it's sunny there today, is it?
Yeah, it's sunny. It's a little cool today, but nice cool, like in the 60s or upper 50s. It's probably seasonal, but it's a beautiful time of the year. It's very low humidity and it's not so hot. Like I know in Arizona, it was about 110 the other day or so.
So, Dr. Melillo, where did your interest in brain disorders begin? And I also wonder what role your mentors had in your journey, leading you to help over 50,000 young children around the world.
Yeah, so really, I started myself in the healthcare field because I was an athlete, and I really was always interested in health and nutrition and exercise, and I loved anatomy when I took it in high school, and I chose to, start in the chiropractic field because it's what helped me the most my life. I'd been seeing a chiropractor since I was a kid, and whenever I got injured, he was the one that helped me the most. And so I decided that, that's where I wanted to go. And when I was there, I fell in love with neurology and neuroscience at a deep level. And I wanted to find some way to bridge that type of exercise, nutrition, holistic with neurology, neuroscience. And so when I graduated, the subspecialty, board subspecialty opened for the first time, which was neurology. And so I started taking that. And there was a doctor that was teaching that, was one of my first major mentors, a guy named Ted Carrick. And he really, we were learning that, but he also was doing very high level rehab. And so the combination of neurology and rehab at really the highest level. And at that time, it was a little bit more, it wasn't really brain, it was more everything else, like, pain, neurology, spinal rehab, body injuries, things like that. But it eventually evolved into the brain. And I became fascinated with it and really wanted to understand everything about it. And at the time in the early 90s, when I was doing this is when Bill Clinton called this the decade of the brain. And so therefore all this new brain research and most interestingly, all these new tools to image the brain, like SPECT scans and fMRIs and CAT scans and PET scans and really high level EEG and magnetoencephalography, ways that we could look at the brain in real time. And what was becoming apparent was couple of things. One is we were learning more about the nature of the brain and also, developmental and neurological issues, that there weren't lesions in the brain, but there was a problem with what was called functional connectivity. It really was a communication breakdown. And a lot of also what was coming out was really understanding the way different areas of the brain, different networks, and the way the hemispheres work, and really a more sophisticated way of looking at that. And there was a book that came out in the early 90s, again, called Brain Asymmetry by a researcher named Richard Davidson out of the University of Wisconsin, and a partner of his, Kenneth Hugdahl. And it was a compilation of years of thousands of papers, and really was an earth-shattering book for me that really gave me a tremendous amount of information. But what really got me into working and looking at it with children was when my own son was diagnosed with ADHD. And then subsequently, my daughter had some issues with learning issues or with dyslexia. My younger son really with OCD and hyperactivity and autism type symptoms. And so really as a parent, I wanted to understand at the deepest level what was actually happening. And the main question for me was what was actually happening in the brain.
Now, there was so much there with your answer that I loved. I love that you found your passion from the fact that you went to a chiropractor as a young athlete. So, both our girls here are gymnasts and both are currently injured, but the oldest has got her eye on a medical career now after all of her doctor's visits that she had in her athletic career. So, Dr. Melillo, is this what led you to create your brain balance program, and what exactly does the program entail?
Well, the interesting thing is one of the things that I've really discovered early on and really have kind of tried to emphasize is that whenever we work with these neurological developmental imbalances, and that's really the root issue, the idea of a functional disconnection and these imbalances between networks that always start in development some way. They first and foremost, usually if a child is or an adult has struggled, it's because they're probably unusually gifted in an area of their brain. There's an area of their brain that is stronger than most. And what happens is that gives them a vulnerability in another network on the other side of the brain or in the same network. I just was talking to a parent last night, and we were talking about that, how they have two children, and she was saying her husband was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD, and she was diagnosed with OCD and ADHD, and her kid, one of them has a high functioning form of autism, and the other one has a function of dyslexia. And she was saying that her kids have all of her gifts because she was very gifted and talented in an area, and she was a gifted child as a young child, but she also has an extreme version of all of her weaknesses. And so that's what we see, is that many of these extreme versions of strengths can come with extreme versions of weaknesses. So, my one younger son who was OCD, ADHD, and autism spectrum, he's a doctor who works with me now, working with these children. And he was always a very, very bright, curious kid. My daughter, who was borderline dyslexic, but started writing songs at the age of 9, out of nowhere, is now really an up and coming singer songwriter out of Nashville. Her album. First album was produced by Zach Brown. She opened for him, and now she's writing for some of the top writers and singers in the world. She's also got her own songs that she's putting out there, and she's really doing well. And we do a podcast together about the unique issues that come about with the right brain dominant and left brain deficit, the anxieties, the social anxieties, the self-esteem issues, the self-doubt, the imposter syndrome, the depression that can come with that. And all of the people in her community struggle with those things. And many of them had a history of learning disabilities or dyslexia, like Zach Brown has severe dyslexia. Ed Sheeran has severe dyslexia. But that dyslexia comes with the gift of songwriting. It's kind of like the opposite of it, right? And my daughter was borderline, but we were able to fix that with her because we recognized it relatively early. So, and then my older son is a builder, architect, designer. He's got, he builds things. He's really incredible with his designs. He's an artist, just really unique. So all of them have these unique talents. And also with that came struggles. But fortunately, we were able to work with all of them, and they do great. They're all doing great.
Now that really gave me chills, and this is the whole reason why I do this podcast. We can see a child in school and they might be struggling in the traditional classroom with the fact that they've just got to sit there and learn. And now you talk about the vulnerabilities there and that the kids have these unique gifts. And we know they have these unique gifts. We just have to help bring them out in our kids or students in the classroom.
That's the thing, right? So what's the answer? The really only good answer is to really correct the imbalance, take away the vulnerability and leave the gift, right? That's ultimately the goal. And so that's really what my work was really focused on. How do we do that? And that's what we've been able to do, and we prove it all the time. I mean, in obviously, I've published over 100 research papers, and and as you said, learning and our experiences. I mean, it's been a lifelong learning experience for me because as I learned more, as I wanted to learn more, I went for other degrees. So I also have a master's in clinical rehabilitation neuropsychology, which was amazing, really learning all the neuropsychological tools and working in some of the top brain rehab and brain injury centers in the world. And then I got a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience because I really wanted to understand the development of the brain as well as anybody could, because that's really where it starts. And that's really where the vulnerabilities get accentuated. So the earlier we can start, the earlier we can get rid of those vulnerabilities and really just make these kids into amazing kids. I mean, I give you an example. I had another kid, let's say, that out of Houston that was dyslexic and really emotionally reactive and would get violent and aggressive, especially with his mom, anytime he felt like he was criticized or embarrassed, because he was so hypersensitive, because the right brain generates emotions like shame and guilt and embarrassment and rejection sensitivity. And he, was struggling in school, of course. And he was a good athlete. He loved sports and he wanted to be around other kids, but he'd also would get very reactive with anybody, if anybody made fun of him or anything. And all these things, the mother came with me and the father came to me. And they were a wonderful family from Mexico that had moved to Houston to help him, but nothing helped him. And they had a list of all these things and complaints in school. This child, when we tested him, he was in seventh grade. He was word reading, which is the definition of dyslexia, by the way. It's not transposing letters. It's if your word reading is below, in my measurement, at least 2 grade levels below, then you're dyslexic. So this child was in seventh grade. He was reading at about 3rd grade, 4th grade level. He was comprehending at a higher level, which is also typical. The right brain is about reading comprehension and understanding the big picture and the meaning. But it's amazing because these kids are so gifted at that they're usually able to comprehend the story, even though they struggle with reading it. And so he was about, at almost at his grade level in comprehension, but reading was really low. We work with him, and after a year, he was now reading. And again, based on neuropsychological tests, he was reading. He was in 8th grade. He was reading at a 10th grade level. He was comprehending at a 10th grade level. And he was, everything that his mom showed me the report card. He was like, the teacher was like, he's such a great kid. He's, so helpful. He's a leader in the class. He's never disrespectful. And, he became a completely different child. And so you hear over and over that things like dyslexia, it's a lifelong disability that you can't ever get, you can only compensate for. That is not true. And it's not true for any of them, really. And so therefore, any of these different disabilities, we can change them. And like, the ultimate for me is when we look at, I work a lot with non-speaking autism, which is, I think, is the most mysterious, but, and we're able to quite often give these kids a voice without taking away their genius brain, which they're all geniuses, by the way.
So, Dr. Melillo, is this what led you to create your brain balance program? And what exactly does the program entail?
Well, there's different levels, and there's been different evolution of my career and my programs. The brain balance program was really my earliest iteration of this, which really, was started in, again, the mid 90s, and then eventually evolved into that. Over the past 10 years, I've really created a much more sophisticated model called the Melillo method, which really is more, the difference is, the achievement centers are really learning centers, and they're not medical facilities. They were really designed primarily for children and pretty high functioning kids that were struggling with some behavioral and learning issues. But what I really wanted to do was work with the most severe, the most difficult, challenging issues around. With even with genetic issues or brain injury, with adults, with babies, and with really severe things like non-speaking autism. And I wanted to figure out that at the highest level and develop a reproducible program where people could come and get reproducible results in a system, but using similar principles of cutting edge neuroscience and healthcare. And that's what we've created. I have two centers here in New York where we do the Melillo method. And so, for me, it's all developmental, meaning that we even know that adults with things like bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, OCD, it really all starts in childhood. And so all of it is developmental in some way. And going back and looking at it from that perspective really helps us to change and, again, deal with the root issue. We're not just looking to manage symptoms. We're not just looking to manage behaviors. And so the earlier we can get, to a child, I just had a 3-year-old yesterday that I was with the parents, and child's not speaking, and a lot of tics and stimming and classic autism type symptoms. And just saying, it's great that they brought him in at 3 years old so that we could really get to him at a relatively early age. And that's even more, even better. I have a 7-month-old I'm working with because the parents had listened to some of my work. And when I said to them, if your child doesn't hit these early milestones, that's a red flag. And so the child was missing all these milestones. And so they brought them into me. And so now we've got that child back on track, starting to hit their milestones. And, and that may completely change the trajectory of this child's life for the rest of their life.
So I've got to ask here, what exactly are the milestones that we should be looking for?
Well, they really start with mostly motor milestones, movement milestones, and then cognitive milestones, which are built on one another. When I first started doing research back in the 90s, the first 10 years I spent just compiling research on everything I could. I read thousands of papers, dozens and dozens of books, and ultimately then put all that together to create my own book called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood: An Evolutionary Perspective, which has been, according to Springer, one of the most successful textbooks they've ever had. And they've asked us to do a second edition 20 years later, which is pretty cool. But in that, the first question we wanted to really ask was, where did brains come from? Like, why did a brain evolve on this planet? What was the first brain that ever existed? And according to some of the best researchers, And this is something that, it's hard to exactly prove because brains don't fossilize, but based on what we do know is that, the first brains really existed because something moved. According to a guy named Rodolfo Linus, there's something called motricity, which means that the ability to move, and living things that don't move don't have brains. Only living things that move have brains. So movement is what initiated the development of brains on this planet. And movement is what initiates the development of a brain in a child. Movement is what leads the way. And so there are these basic movements that we have because in the human brain, it's unique in that we have the largest brain per body size for any primate, but because we're bipedal, we have the smallest birth canal. So we have these really big heads with these really small birth canals. So we have to keep our brains relatively restricted. And so therefore, 75, 80% of our brain growth actually happens outside of the womb, which no other animal has that at all, right? Almost all the other animals, their brains are mostly developed in the womb. And they can move really, a horse can run in under 2 hours after they're born. A human, in the best case scenario, we're going to walk at 12 months. So the part of our brain that moves us isn't there when we're born or even before birth. So, but we need to move. We need to move from the very beginning. So we're born with these things called primitive reflexes or neonatal reflexes. And this has been a major area of my research. And these are these automated program movements that allows a baby to move, to engage the world, to then stimulate their senses and stimulate the genes that get the brain to grow. And it starts prenatally. So a baby automatically gets into the right position in the third trimester, upside down and backwards, without the cord getting wrapped around their neck and deep enough down in the birth canal that they induce birth. That's the baby that does that. How do they do that? They do that because they have these primitive reflexes that allow them to do that at the right time. If they're not in the right position, if they're in a breech position, if the cord's wrapped around their neck, if they're not deep enough down in the canal, if the mom needs to be induced at birth, why? And I believe the major reason is that these reflexes aren't there when they're supposed to, and the baby isn't moving the way that they're supposed to. If there's a C-section, why? Most often it's because of that. If these reflexes are there to help them push themselves through the birth canal. They literally, especially at the end, they push themselves out because of these reflexes. If a baby needs forceps, if they need, assistance, vacuum, if they need to push down on the mom's belly, why? And quite often it's because those reflexes aren't there. First milestone outside the womb is latching on if a mom chooses to breastfeed. And we find that about 85 to 90% of the kids that are non-speaking, especially, they couldn't latch on appropriately. So that's the rooting and sucking reflex. That's one of the first milestones, and that's not there. Why? Because it's delayed, it's behind schedule. And then, the idea of rolling over at 3 to 5 months, crawling on the belly and doing the commando crawl. Most people don't even realize that's a milestone. People come to me and they have children that are non-speaking or that have issues, and they'll often say to me, my child's development was perfect. They had no problems with, any of their milestones. And then I say, well, let me go through it step by step with you. And there's always an issue. There's always usually a significant issue somewhere, but nobody told them that. The pediatrician said, oh, it was okay. It doesn't matter if they don't crawl. It doesn't matter if they didn't do the commando crawl. It doesn't matter if they only use one side of their body, or it's okay to scoot on their butt. It's not. All of those things are very, very specific. And just because we say it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean that's true, because it doesn't. And so those are the early signs. And basically, every child at around 12 months should walk a few steps, should talk a few words, and should point and have really good eye contact and joint attention. If they don't, then why? And what we've been able to show is usually these reflexes didn't come on. They didn't miss these milestones. Things didn't hit on schedule the way they should, or then they tried to skip over them or do it in some unusual way. And that doesn't work. You have to deal with the issue. And then what happens is these reflexes are there to lead us to that first year. And then once we hit those milestones, they should go away. And then we should now be released to do even much more advanced stuff. And what we should do is once we do if we do hit those milestones, we should never lose them. And if we do lose them, it's because these reflexes didn't go away. And now this normal developmental trajectory where the right brain should take the lead in the first 3 years and then the left brain and create the differences between the right and left brain, that it throws that off and it creates either too much where the right brain is too much in the lead or the left brain comes online too early and pushes the right brain down. That's what happens, I believe, in regressive autism. When they lose all these skills, it's really because of that abnormal switching that's coming about.
Dr. Melillo, as you're talking, I'm curious, did you ever come across the work of Glenn Doman? I purchased all his books when my kids were young.
Sure, he was a pioneer along with Jane Ayers, who was an OT who started the sensory integration therapy movement. There's some really good people that obviously, I also learned a lot from and read their books and read their papers. And I think I've taken it and now, they didn't have access to the amount of brain research that I had when I was starting because of all this new tools and brain imaging and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do all these different degrees to be able to learn from different perspectives and learn it at the deepest level. And I think I've been able to take all of that work and take it to a whole different level. Tomatis's work with sound or Len's work with colors and lenses. I've incorporated all that into my work, but none of them really came up with a real understanding of what was the primary problem. None of them really actually solved that problem, but they had an idea around it, and they knew, how to be able to try to change what was going on without really understanding exactly what the primary problem was. When we really understood the functional disconnection model and also understood the idea of epigenetics and understood the idea of development and developmental movements and put all that together and then also understood the way, the autonomic system evolves and develops and the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And now in our most latest work on how that really relates in the neuroimmunology piece, because, there's a lot of people out there in the biomedical world who know a lot and, doing things with food sensitivities and inflammation and all of that is great, but they are taught and believe that it all starts in the gut and it starts in the body. It doesn't. It starts in the brain and the brainstem and the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And that starts with immaturity in the brainstem, which starts with retained primitive reflexes, which starts with epigenetic influences on gene expression, preconception. So it's, a whole thing there. And so, there's been some great work and I've read everything I could get my hands on early on and incorporated that. And I think, evolved it to, where we have it today.
So, Dr. Melillo, for people who might notice some vulnerabilities or milestones that they're concerned about, what would you suggest for them?
Yeah, I mean, in the ideal world, obviously, if a parent has, no limitations or whatever, which, is what we see. We have people that come from all over the world. The best case is to come to New York and see us in one of our two centers with my staff, with me, and really allow us to, because examining a child appropriately or an adult and looking for things like primitive reflexes, there's a technique to it and it's physical. You have to touch the person. That's the proper exam and really doing the proper evaluation. And then we put together a program and the majority of that program is going to be home. So we're going to eventually send that person back home. We do have people that are around us that live here in New York and New York metropolitan area, and they come here on a regular basis. But at least half of the patients we see come from all over the United States and all over the world, and they come here for anywhere from 2 weeks to a year, where they'll come and live here and stay here, and bring their patients in or come in for us to work with them. But for some people, that's not possible. So we do have virtual programs where myself and my staff will do virtual consults, and will be able to, based on experience and history and the forms that they fill out, we can, have a pretty good idea of what is going on. And then we create a home program. We've created an incredible virtual program for both our patients that we see and go home, or ones that we don't see. We just created, I think, between 300 and 400 really high level videos this year alone, to be really instructive on what we do. And the videos we give people, our patients, are the same videos we use to train our staff. One of the things that we're focused on is trying to train the parent or the patient to be able to take this program and do it at home, because that's going to be most cost effective and time efficient long term. But some people don't have the capacity. Obviously, small children and parents, they need proper training on how to do that. So that virtual program is can be done as well. But then obviously my books, Disconnected Kids, it's an instruction manual of how to take at least the basics of this program and start to apply them. And I get letters, literally, emails or messages on my social media every day from someone around the world who's used the book alone and gotten miraculous changes in their kids. And then I've also trained thousands of doctors and therapists around the world who also do a version of what we do. What we do here in our centers is unique at this point. We want to be able to import that around the world. But right now, at the concepts and the basics of what we do, we have people that are certified around the world that are doing that as well.
So to wrap this all up, we become aware as parents or teachers of these important developmental milestones. And if we notice deficiencies in these milestones, we can purchase your book, Disconnected Kids. It's currently in its third edition now. Or we could come visit you in your centers in New York, or we can take online courses to learn more. Someone could also work with you via virtual training. But can you share where we should start if we want to learn more about your programs and services?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, if you have a child that's struggling or you're struggling yourself, there's a gift there as well. And the more the disability, the stronger the gift is. And that you can get rid of the disability or minimize the disability without losing the gift. And we're not trying to change. When we say we want to change the brain, we're not trying to change somebody. Some people may get offended and say, hey, I'm fine like I am, just leave me alone. We're just trying to help that person become the best version of themselves. And if they have things like retained reflexes or imbalances or other issues going on, in their body, leaky gut, inflammation, they're not the best version of themselves. And they may be amazing and really doing incredible things. And obviously they should always be respected, but they should also have the opportunity to become the best version, or parents should have, the opportunity to be able to get their child to speak, to be able to, understand and talk to them. And that's what we hear. So the idea is all of that is possible. You're going to be told it's not. You're going to be told that, there is no hope and just accept it. But that is not true. And if you investigate, it's not easy. None of this is easy. I say this to my parents that I see all the time. I'm going to give you a program. We're going to teach you how to do it. But none of this is easy. And I know that. That, right? And they inspire me. They're the ones that inspire me, the sacrifices that they make to help their children, or what people will do to help themselves. So, there's so much hope out there. And don't let anybody take that away from you, and recognize that, your child's not broken. You're not broken, that you're actually gifted. You just have to become more balanced. And if you do, you can have a whole different life. And that's the life you deserve.
So to close out our episode, Dr. Melillo, I've got to bring this back to the beginning where you recognize something with your own child that led you to this work. And to remind our listeners of the thousands of people you're helping around the world, I started with Glenn Doman's method when my children were young with movement, but now you've taken our understanding to new heights. I want to thank you so much for the important work that you're doing.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.